Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Episode. Today we're going to be continuing the series, The History of the Dead, where I take a look at every single mainline House of the Dead entry and talk about the history of the franchise. And if you can count to 4, we've gotten to the House of the Dead 4. This is the first game to be in true HD, and it does change a lot of things up with the House of the Dead formula while keeping to its roots. And interestingly, it's in part a retread of the story of the House of the Dead 2, and really does loop back around on the story's continuity. But it's an absolutely outstanding game, one of my favorites in the series, and I definitely am excited to talk about it. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe. That notification bell definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But honestly, the House of the Dead 4 is a spectacular game that I've always enjoyed playing. I've had it on the PlayStation 3 for the longest time, but I am playing the arcade original version here. And some of the names and faces in this game are going to sound familiar, and I will talk about them as we get to them. But right off the top, this game has so much more story than any other House of the Dead games that have come before it. And a lot of that is because the story is kind of retreading old territory in a new way. You'll see James there, James Taylor, maybe for the musician, never been quite sure, is in this game. And if that name doesn't sound familiar, he was also in the House of the Dead 2. And basically within this story, it's kind of flashing back and forward in time between the events of House of the Dead 2 and the current day in the game for House of the Dead 4. But jumping right into the first chapter, this is just a different feeling House of the Dead. 1, 2, and 3 felt like they were the first generation games. 4 and beyond feel like a new generation. And for better or worse, part of that is because the violence has been fundamentally toned down in the House of the Dead 4. You're not going to be blowing off limbs, you're not going to be shooting holes through torsos, you're not going to be exploding heads. Sega scaled back on this, but they did add in different elements such as motion controls in the gun itself. If you shake it, you can activate certain features, and a lot of the enemies are shared between the House of the Dead 2 and this game, but of course in full HD. And even if we lost that gore and that exploding body parts, the amount of zombies we get on screen in lieu of that is absolutely amazing. There's more zombies running around in House of the Dead 4 than you have seen in any of the previous games on one screen. That's just because the processing power of the hardware that this ran on in arcades, and then when it came over to PlayStation 3, was such that they could push more models on screen at once. And the models absolutely do look spectacular. We still get the standard branching paths here, and AMS has a new PDA. They love to show the design, but I do love that the developers have maintained that branching pathway so you get to in part decide which way you want to work your way through the story. It's just a nice feature, and I'm glad that they kept that there while revamping a lot of the old enemies for a new fresh look. And this is also a generational change, which we start getting these punk zombies, these zombies with mohawks. It's a different look for the franchise, and while I 100% think it does work, I do wish they hadn't leaned so heavily into it compared to previous games in the franchise. But you get a ton of waves of zombies, and shooting more is always fun. It's not going to be to the same caliber as something like Scarlet Dawn, a game we'll get to very shortly, where you can have like 50 to 75 zombies on screen at once, but you are getting like 15 to 20 on screen at a time, and with that grenade power up, you really can clear out a lot at once. It's just a bigger, faster paced, more action oriented game all around, and it definitely drops a decent amount of the horror elements that were especially prevalent in 1 and decently prevalent in 2. As this series has gone on, less of the horror has appeared and more of the action oriented aspect has made its way through. But I will say the character designs for the bosses and for the enemies are still absolutely spectacular. Sega's designers knew what they were doing when they were making different bosses, and House of the Dead 4 is absolutely no exception. They definitely pushed the horror elements when it came to the bosses. I absolutely love the design here. Justice with that big weak point, that tongue hanging out of his mouth. It is just such a fun look, and with those 4 arms, it's just an absolute wild chase through this sewer system. It is amazing, and if the sewer system looks familiar, it's because in some ways it does emulate these sewers in the original House of the Dead 2. It is just modernized, and as throughout the video, I will point out more links between the story and gameplay of this game and House of the Dead 2, because these are the two, in my opinion, most interconnected stories in the entire franchise. 4 and 2 go together. You should almost play them back to back to better understand. But this game got a ton of voice acting, and it's the first game in the series with the voice acting, while still cheesy, is relatively good. So go ahead and listen for like 35-45 seconds, and I'll come back and talk more about the game. Enjoy!
Is this your first time here?
Yeah.
There's something I need to look into. I can't shake the feeling that things didn't end like we thought 3 years ago.
I'll help however I can, James. It's an honor to work with you. Hard to believe we're underground, huh? There's also a complex series of sewers down here. But... Whoa, what's happening?
It's just better voice acting than the franchise has ever had, and Kate's voice actor gets even better in The House of the Dead Scarlet Dawn. But moving on to the next area of the game, going into more sewers, it's just a different type of look. You know, we're used to a lot more of labs, haunted houses, things such as that, but this game definitely leans more into The House of the Dead 3's kind of visual setup and storytelling, but that's not a bad thing, and a lot of the enemies are still appearing in House of the Dead 4. These water slime monsters, whatever they may be, were things that we were seeing in the original House of the Dead, and I do love that there is that continuity between games, and in some instances there's a lot more. Now, pay attention to this. What I assume to be a kappa is going to become very important in about 10 to 12 minutes in this video, but I don't want to spoil it too much. But there is another game that uses a lot of the assets of the House of the Dead 4 that technically isn't part of the franchise, but is a light gun game made by Sega, so stay tuned for that. You will see there, I take a continue. This game is hard. It's not the hardest in the series in my opinion, but it's definitely pulling no punches, and you're going to have to get really good at aiming and screen space management if you want to see the end of the game on a decent amount of credits. But I know some people that can 1cc this game, and they are quite good at it. But talking about shared enemies between games that aren't inside of the franchise, we do have shared enemies within the franchise as well. These eels are lampreys. If we go back to the original House of the Dead a long time ago, in both our video history and the game history, there they are, and there's some definite inspiration. I feel like this chain link fence here I have seen before. Now, I've looked at the developers' credits and I couldn't find any overlap, but if we go to another one of my favorite light gun games of all time, Beastbuster Second Nightmare by SNK and 80K, you see that same fence and you see the zombies trying to break through it. Now, this may be a total coincidence, but Sega and every other developer plays pretty much every other game out there to see what the competition is doing. And not only do we have that same chain link fence system here, but we also have a very similar vibe to these zombies that we see in the House of the Dead 4, these kind of punk looking characters. So it's possible that in some small ways, Beastbuster Second Nightmare inspired something like House of the Dead 4. Believe me, comment down below and you tell me, am I going too far with that connection, or do you think I might be actually right? Because sometimes I see things where they aren't there, and sometimes I see things that are definitely connected. And every once in a while you do get a decent amount of gore. You can see that zombie's skull and brain, but it is quite rare, and I do wish the game had given us a little bit more of this. But as we move further on and get more of the story, you're going to discover something about the world of the House of the Dead 4. Something is unfolding in the background, and that is a nuclear weapons launch. Somebody is trying to reset mankind in the story, and that has been a trend through the entire game. Now, you watched the events of House of the Dead 3 in the previous video, and this game does take place before that. House of the Dead 3 in canon is the latest game as far as the timeline is concerned, but someone's trying to launch nukes and we have to stop that. But there's so many small touches in the game, like these welding zombies here. If you shoot their propane tanks, they can explode on screen. If there are enemies near them, they will explode everything else around them. This game gives you more than one way to play pretty much every scene unless it's your stock scrub zombie, and I do love that Sega considered that. But moving up this elevator here, we're going to come to a boss that's going to look relatively familiar, and it definitely is a callback and hearkening to the original bosses of House of the Dead 1. Because as we jump from one elevator platform to another, a gigantic spider is going to come rushing out from the ground below us. And if that doesn't look familiar, and if you've never played the House of the Dead, the original, or watched the video, you should watch that before this, but I will show you right now. Spiders crawling up towards you, definitely a trope in the House of the Dead. This boss fight in a lot of ways feels like a rehash of the first one, except in a very positive way. It's not like it's a copy and paste job, it's more of an homage and remembering where this franchise came from. And when I originally played this boss, my head immediately went to the original game. But like I said, this story does loop back on itself, so go ahead and get a little bit of story, and I'll come back and tell you why I let you hear it.
Ever thought about the future? What will happen to the world if humans continue to breed? Don't you see? Humans have set themselves upon the path to inevitable destruction.
Now, if you don't remember, our friend Goldman here had a little bit of an accident, self-caused, in The House of the Dead 2. And again, if you haven't watched the videos in the order in which I published them, you definitely should go back and watch that after watching this to better understand. But Goldman has left a little bit of a surprise for us in the same area of The House of the Dead 2, and we're going to have to figure out what's going on. But we're not quite there yet because we still got a lot of game to get through. And it's not a good game without a subway station, and The House of the Dead 4 has you covered. Now, the middle of the game, it's not as fast-paced and it's not as exciting to me as the first third and the last third. This is a ton of fun and it's got a lot of callbacks, but it moves a little bit slower. But you'll see here in just a moment, and I do love that torso jumping out of that monster closet, a quite literal monster closet for the game. As we turn around, we're going to see an enemy that maybe you might recognize, these axe-wielding enemies. And again, it's just an amazing call back to the original House of the Dead 2. You'll see here 2 axe-wielding enemies come out and attack us, and then as we move forward, 2 smaller enemies are going to pop out. If we go back to the House of the Dead 4, after we get up here on the elevator and turn left, there's going to be 2 small enemies popping out after the axe attack. It is the exact same setup as the House of the Dead 2, it's just modernized and in a different area, and I love that the developers intentionally put those little tiny nods in there for fans of the game to just remember, because when I first played that, I knew in the back of my head somewhere I had seen it before. But again, just how many enemies this game puts out at once. Scarlet Dawn does even more, but this was just that line in the sand for the series where everything got bigger and better. But as we get on this train here to encounter another boss fight, this is definitely my favorite boss fight in the game, just based on how difficult it is and kind of the overall setting. But as we come on, maybe the name of this boss will seem slightly familiar to you, but they chainsaw the train in half, jump down, and that is the Empress. And if that doesn't sound familiar, I will tell you why it should sound familiar. If we go back to the final boss of the House of the Dead 2, as they come up on the screen, it is the Emperor. It's more tarot, and it is more lineage between these two games that they share. And that's what I love so much about the House of the Dead 4, is just how many nods and story ties it has to the franchise, and House of the Dead 2 in particular. But just from the perspective of a boss fight, a dual chainsaw wielding Empress is absolutely spectacular. And as you run through the car here, and she chases you and starts cutting into the train, it's got such big horror movie vibes, the chainsaw wielding maniac. You know, everything is just so incredible. Texas Chainsaw Massacre links, it's just something that you will fondly remember even if you don't know where you're remembering it from. The developers did such a great job of leaning on those horror tropes in this game in particular, really to just make it feel like a universe that you have been familiar with, even if it is your first time ever playing it. And that's why, at least tonally, I think the House of the Dead 4 may be my favorite game of the franchise as far as how they tell the story is concerned. The original House of the Dead will always have my favorite setting, but 4 just does a great job telling us a long story. Almost feels like a console release, and here Goldman is again talking about the evolution of man and how he feels that is a flawed situation. This entire franchise rests on that concept of what man does to the environment and how he has no checks and balances compared to every other animal. But one thing I haven't let you do yet is listen to the soundtrack. Now, it is way more action oriented and less horror and jazzy, but I still absolutely love it. So go ahead and listen for like 45 seconds, and I'll come back and get to the part of the video where I tie this all together with House of the Dead 2. But enjoy, because it is great.
From here.
Damn, they found her!
It's an awesome soundtrack, and while it is a ton different compared to what we're used to, I absolutely still love it. And if this environment doesn't look familiar, it's almost like a recreation of the original Italian environment in The House of the Dead 2. But if you do play this game, depending on what region you're playing it in, Sega will tell you that this is one of two places, either apparently Italy or London. It is odd that depending on the translation being used, it changes the setting of the game, but that may have just been a little bit of a continuity error, because trying to keep track of all the details across this franchise as developers come and go and other people put their hands into the House of the Dead universe, I'm sure that some little bits of aspect do get confused. But I love this hanging clock here, and it basically telegraphing what you're going to be using that for moving forward. But it does have that sort of gothic European vibe going for it that The House of the Dead 2 had. It just takes a little bit of time to get to it, but these environments here are some of my absolute favorites in the game. This old tower with the clock hanging off waiting for repair, it is just so much fun to see in action. And I love that boss design, Temperance. He's basically just a giant blob with a huge mouth, but now he's going to be an absolute nothing, because this clock is going to come down in the most Looney Tunes fashion ever and bonk him on the head. This game is not trying to be funny, but every once in a while it's funny all the same, even if it's the next scene is going to be quite dramatic. But that's classic Sega, having different tonal shifts in the story and in the vibe in the same game, sometime intentionally being funny and sometime unintentionally being funny. But as James and Kate get up onto this balcony and look out onto the city, it is absolutely in ruins, and it's one of the best looks in the entire franchise in my opinion, seeing everything that has happened in the background. But you will see here that an email went out to the AMS agents, and it is from Goldman, and he's saying everything is set, and it's just an hour from a nuclear missile launch. Now, how is Goldman doing this? Because we just saw him fall off a building in The House of the Dead 2, and that's kind of fun, seeing an enemy, seeing a boss that you remember from the story that you know is dead, reappearing in the game. But this might be my favorite section in the entire game, is how far it ties to The House of the Dead 2. Oddly, these soldier enemies look like they are German Nazis, and it is a strange addition to the game because it does not tonally match whatsoever, but what does match is this car sequence. Shoot the windshield out, drive forward, go over a bridge. Where have we seen that before? Obviously, The House of the Dead 2. This is taking place in the exact same area that game took place in. If we scroll forward, we have the same bridge. Sure, it looks nicer. Sure, it's been a little bit improved since the last time we drove over it, but we are retreading the same territory in such a great way. It's a nod to the original games. It's showing you the same areas, but lovingly recreated, and having the story pivoted. Because if we look up to the Goldman Tower here, if we're in The House of the Dead 2, we are looking up at the same tower, just in a more modern way, because the story is continuing. And as we go into this tower in The House of the Dead 2, the doors open up and we have these enemies waiting for us. And this is maybe my favorite moment in the entire series, tying two games together. It says, it's like they're inviting me in. And if we go back to The House of the Dead 4, we have 5 enemies, not 3 now, but as we shoot them all and go through the doors, Kate says it feels like they're inviting us in. Obviously it's in Japanese, but you get the point. It's literally using the same lines of dialogue to reintroduce the space that you've been to before in a completely different way as the enemy, the star, comes out to attack you. It's just such a great callback to where we've been before, and part of the reason I love The House of the Dead as a franchise is not just because it's an arcade light gun shooter, my favorite genre, but it's because it pays so much fan service lovingly to the people that have been supporting this franchise since it started. And I love this spinning attack here. It's just wild. I don't know how he is not dizzy after that, but he's going to be feeling a lot worse because he is going to 100% end up dead. But how this ties back to The House of the Dead 2 is quite interesting, even how we rehash territory. It's going to show you a cutscene from years earlier of Goldman in his office, and 2 agents are going to run in. And obviously, if you don't remember from the original game, one of those agents is James. He is going to come in and confront Goldman, and that is just so interesting, because if we jump back to The House of the Dead 2 proper, and Goldman's cutscene here, this is just showing the same story in a slightly different way, and it is so much fun how it chooses to do that. And I'm not spoiling every little detail. You should play these games, play 2 and then play 4, so you can get all the different details that you need and discover it for yourself. Now, what wasn't in the original House of the Dead 2 is this Japanese themed area, and it's really interesting because earlier in the video I mentioned that there is a game made by Sega of China that is not in the House of the Dead franchise whatsoever, but is basically an unofficial House of the Dead game, and that is going to be Sega Golden Gun, because it basically took a lot of the assets from this game here and repurposed them. So if we move over to Sega Golden Gun, a bonus episode you'll obviously be getting, this is basically a Chinese version of House of the Dead using some of these same enemy designs. You'll see here as we turn towards the water, the slime monsters from the House of the Dead 4 and the original House of the Dead are going to be here, and there's also going to be some kappas in the game that I will show you next week. But let's move up into this tower here and get to Goldman's office, because we're not quite sure throughout the game if we're actually going to find Goldman or not. The game leaves it ambiguous, but he's left us a message here. Goldman doesn't exist. He set something up for the future, and we were able to stop that nuclear launch. But then he pops up on the monitor and tells us something, and I am going to leave this to your imagination, and if you haven't played the game before, because this is a quite pivotal moment that leads into the story of the House of the Dead 3. But the story developers at Sega did an incredible job combining this game's story with the House of the Dead 2 and the overall narrative of the House of the Dead franchise. And as this door drops down in the floor, it's just such an amazing set piece. This is just an incredible game. I 100% love it. I love the story. I love the lore. It doesn't really do anything wrong in my opinion, except maybe reduce down the violence. But again, the boss designs are just absolutely spectacular. This crystalline dragonfly that comes out is spectacular, and it is the world. Every boss just keeps getting a bigger, more powerful name in the game, and I will say I find this to be the hardest boss in the entire House of the Dead franchise. It is not an easy fight, and you need to be accurate as all hell to be able to defeat him. But it is a ton of fun. It is huge spectacle, and it's probably the biggest spectacle up to date in the House of the Dead franchise until we get to the boss of Scarlet Dawn. But don't forget, I am doing these videos in the order of release, not in the story order. I had to make a decision as to what to do, and I felt like release order was probably a better way for me to explain what I was thinking. But seeing the Goldman building here, seeing the world come out of the ground, it is such a great set piece to battle into, and there is more than one stage. The minute you think you have defeated the world, they go into their next evolution, and it is just so fun to see. I love that kind of dragonfly aspect that now it almost turns into maybe an arachnid with all those legs, but it feels more like a clownfish or almost like a puffer fish, having all of those tendrils coming out of the back. I love the organic mixture between animal and man, and it's such a good look, and it's a lot about what they've been talking about in the story of the game, how man interacts with nature and the world around him, and obviously the world having all animals in it, including man. It is not surprising that the world as an entity can take on whatever form he wants in his own way. It's a small touch, it's a small nod, but it's spectacular. And I will show you guys the ending, even though it does have some slight spoilers, because honestly, you should go play this game even if I do spoil the ending ever so slightly for you. And tell me down below, have you ever played the House of the Dead 4? Because I am curious. I feel like it's maybe one of the entries that less people played, because I do hear less people talking about it. And I am curious as to hear what you guys think. But the boss does have a third phase. Now he basically hatches out of his own body like a chrysalis or a snake leaving its own skin, and their bullets are impervious to him. He cannot be harmed by this, so James is going to make the ultimate sacrifice to be able to save the world, even though it's not really going to go exactly the way he planned. And there is that detonation, and it is quite interesting that he has that data on his phone, but as he jumps into the world here, he is going to explode alongside with it and save Kate. And that is the story of the House of the Dead 4, and that is the story of how it fundamentally ties to the House of the Dead 2. I love the interweaving. It's just a spectacularly done narrative, and for Sega and Arcade, having a good narrative is definitely a rarity. But depending on what ending you get, you're going to get a little bit more detail. What it's always going to tell you is there's some humanity left somewhere, and that the story is going to continue in the House of the Dead 3. So if you play this game and you haven't played the House of the Dead 3, go play it. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.